Welcome to the Key Chapters of the Bible podcast. This is a daily podcast that's going through the key chapters of God's Word. Welcome to our study in the key chapters of the Bible. Today we're turning to Micah chapter 5, and it might feel a bit like Christmas in August, because today we're turning to one of the most famous Christmas passages that is probably read by nearly every church at some point during every Christmas season. So today we're turning to Micah chapter 5. I'm Russ Brewer, and you are listening to our daily podcast that is going through the key chapters of the Bible. And again, today we're turning to Micah chapter 5. Now, as we turn to this chapter, yesterday we gave a quick overview of Micah the prophet and his message, and how there's just this strong theme of judgment throughout this book, as well as a strong promise of restoration. Micah often speaks of the remnant of God's people that he will restore to himself under the rule of the king, the servant, the Messiah. Now, Micah was writing around the time that Assyria invaded the northern kingdom. I remember that, and just in 722 BC, they were exiled. And his words to the southern kingdom were essentially telling them that even though they were spared the fate that the northern kingdom suffered, even they, the southern kingdom, were still looking at God's judgment for their sins. For instance, we saw yesterday in Micah 4:10 that one day Babylon will invade them and carry them off to exile. And so today we're seeing that Micah is now going to foretell a day when they will fend off a future invasion of a future Assyria, but the Lord will protect them in that day. And so let's turn to Micah chapter 5 and unpack this key chapter starting in verse 1. Verse 1 is actually continuing the message from the end of chapter 4, where there'll be this final attack upon Israel that will include a siege laid against them by Babylon, where this invading army will capture their king. Now here you see in verse 1, this king is a weak king. By definition, he's not trusting the Lord, and therefore he can't lead the people to trust the Lord. And so they are invaded, and he is captured and taken away. Now, all of these prophecies were fulfilled with Zedekiah in 2 Kings 24 and 25. And so he was the weak king. But then verse 2 introduces a new king, a new ruler who is unlike the kings or the rulers of this day. This one will rule in righteousness and power. And as we read these verses, they're going to sound immediately familiar. For instance, verse 2 says, "But as for you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, too little to be among the clans of Judah, from you one will come forth for me to be ruler in Israel. His goings forth are from long ago, from the days of eternity." And so that's verse 2. And notice with verse 2, that begins with the word but here. Now that word but there shows us the clear difference between the strong ruler who is to come versus the weak ruler of verse 1. Now you'll also notice that verse 2 is addressed to the town of Bethlehem, Bethlehem Ephrathah, which is about 5 miles south of Jerusalem, of course, the birthplace of Jesus. The term Ephrathah there just distinguishes this Bethlehem from another one up in the north, and so this is where Jesus was going to be born. Now at Christmastime we sing the song, "O Little Town of Bethlehem," because pretty much everyone today knows that's where Jesus was born, and yet here we're seeing that this was prophesied 700 years before Christ's birth, and at that time, Bethlehem was on the map as the birthplace of King David, and so Micah is just showing us here this link between this coming king and the king, the greatest king up till that point in Israel's history, King David. And hopefully all of that then reminds them as well as us of the covenant that God made with David back in 2 Samuel 7, where the Lord promised to David that one of his descendants would rule upon his throne forever. Well, going on, verse 2 also says this king will be a ruler in Israel. That term ruler there speaks of his dominion, his authority, the obedience that the people will give to him. He is described as being from long ago, from the days of eternity. And this same terminology was used of the Lord, used of Yahweh back in Genesis 21, verse 33, where Abraham calls him the everlasting God. And so this phraseology here just points to the divine nature of this coming king. He'll be able to rule forever because he's existed forever. And although he will come forth from Bethlehem, he will not begin there. He will come from eternity past. And here we're seeing that Micah is telling us this 700 years before the birth of Christ, so long ago. I mean, this must have just blown the people's minds. And yet we see this just in the New Testament, but it's unpacked and unfolded in so many ways. For instance, familiar verses like John 1:1 says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." And so Jesus, God in the flesh, would fulfill this prophecy 700 years later, and he would have these two natures combined into one person. He would be born fully human, born of a woman, born like everyone else, and yet he would be eternal, fully man and fully God. Well, verse 3 brings us back to the timeline of how these events will unfold. If you look at verse 3 opens saying, "Therefore he will give them up." Now the NIV says they will be abandoned. And this just speaks of the plan of God for his people. Both Isaiah and Micah were contemporaries of each other, and both prophesied that God would judge Israel for her sins and Judah as well. But at the completion of that judgment, God would bring his people back to the land, and he would bring a new king on the scene who would establish his kingdom to be governed by justice and righteousness. Verse 3 goes on to say, "Until the time when she who is in labor is given birth." Now, that's not speaking of Mary there. That's speaking about the labor pains we read about yesterday in chapter 4, verses 9 and 10, which all look ahead to the end of times when the nations will attack Israel, and that just be that time of suffering for them, which will ultimately result in the bringing forth, the birthing, so to speak, of this messianic kingdom. Verse 3 says, "At that time, the remnant of his brother shall return to the children of Israel." And that just means, just think about that, all around this world, for the most part, Jewish folks reject Jesus as their Messiah, as their God and their King. And we even see here in other places as well that this rejection is prophesied here. But we're also seeing right here that there is coming a day when this rejection will come to an end, and the Jewish people will be gathered together under the lordship of Jesus. I love that idea, and I can't wait for that. Well, verse 4 goes on to say that when this happens, he will arise and shepherd his flock in the strength of the Lord, in the majesty of the name of the Lord his God. Now we know that Jesus, of course, is our chief shepherd. He calls himself a shepherd several times, like in John 10. And so he's going to be the shepherd here. And it says they will remain because at that time he will be great to the ends of the earth. And so when the Jews finally do return to Jesus, the Messiah will rise on up and shepherd them in that kingdom, and that kingdom will spread to the furthest ends of this earth. So that day is coming, but before we get to that day, we have to go through the days of verses 5 and 6. And again, we're kind of sliding back and forth between two different events here, but verses 5 and 6 take us to the cataclysmic events that precede the establishment of the Messianic kingdom. And so verse 5 speaks of days when Assyria invades their land but will be repulsed. Now, who's this Assyria here? Well, the general consensus is that the Assyria here is just Micah's way of speaking of the region from the north that will invade Israel from its northern border. Remember, we saw back in Ezekiel 38 and 39 how you got Gog and Magog coming from the nations on the north and descending upon Israel in the final days. We've even seen in the book of Daniel how you'll have this revised Roman Empire just bringing this assault upon Israel. And so what you have here is just this poetical way of calling all of those nations Assyria, descending upon Israel. But in verse 6, even though these northern invaders will come, it's capitalized because it's the Lord, he will deliver his people from these armies. And think about what he's saying here. Again, if this is just this poetical way, this futuristic, prophetic, poetical way of describing those countries that come, remember that when the first Assyrian invasion of Judah happened, you had that leader, that Assyrian leader, Sennacherib. He comes, he lays siege to Jerusalem, and Hezekiah and the people, they trust in the Lord, and the angel of the Lord wipes out 185,000 of those Assyrian soldiers. And so here you just get in the sense that just as the Lord defended his people from that first Assyrian invasion, that next Assyria, that future Assyria that embodies the warring nations from the north, the Lord will defend his people against that future army as well. Well, going on to verses 7 and 8, these verses once again remind us of who will populate this Messianic kingdom. These people will be the remnant of Jacob. They'll be scattered around the world, but they'll be restored back to the Lord. And once that kingdom, that Messianic kingdom is established, all of their enemies will be cut off. And so now we're back to establishing the Messianic kingdom. And verses 10 to 15 speak of all of the moral reform that will be just established with this kingdom. Remember from yesterday, back in Micah 4:2, it spoke of a day when the people will want to know God's ways and walk according to his law. Now we're seeing what this reformation will look like. They won't have horses and chariots for war. And why is that? Well, Deuteronomy 17:16 talks about how the king should not multiply horses because the people might put their trust in them rather than the Lord. And so in the Messianic kingdom, we will be trusting in Jesus to keep our peace. Remember, back in verse 5 says he will be our peace. Likewise, in verse 11, their man-made defenses will be done away with. In verse 12, their evil attempts at spiritism, trying to find truth apart from the Lord, outside the Lord, through things like fortune-telling, that'll be done away with. Likewise, in verses 13 and 14, all forms of idolatry will be removed. And then in verse 15, it ends by saying, "And I will execute vengeance and anger and wrath on the nations which have not obeyed." And all of that just points to that final day of reckoning that the nations will face before the Lord. And so that's Micah 5. As we said yesterday, so often these prophets are giving us the same basic outline to coming events in this world. Israel and Judah will be judged and sent off into exile, and yet God's people will return. And the near fulfillment of this return was when the Jews began to return in 538 BC under Zerubbabel's leadership. And that return came in several waves through the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. But the ultimate return won't happen until the end of times when the Lord establishes his messianic kingdom. And so there is coming a day when the Jewish people will recognize that Jesus is their Messiah and their messianic king, and they will return to him, and he will establish his kingdom once and for all. And yet, even as all of this will one day occur, before that messianic kingdom is established, a global power will arise on the scene and invade Israel from the north, and yet the Lord will defend his people in that day, much like he defended them in the days of Sennacherib. He will defeat her enemies, and all the world will recognize the rule of this messianic king. And so, in many ways, the book of Micah is giving us this familiar message, and yet also here he's giving us something new. He's giving us this key, critical way to identify this coming king. This king will have been born in Bethlehem, and he will not be like any other person. He will be divine, and yet his rule will be one of a gracious and loving shepherd, and he will grant peace to his people and spread peace throughout this world. And so as we think about this passage here, and hopefully just meditating upon these principles throughout our day, we can be blown away with the accuracy of these prophecies that were fulfilled 700 years after they were given. But we could also see that God is not done with his people. They still have yet to be fully restored to him. And so as we close out our time together, perhaps you and I together can just use this time here just to pray for the Jewish people. Let's just be praying for a revival among the Jewish people, that God would be working among them, granting them even a willingness to consider just how amazingly these prophecies were fulfilled in Jesus, that they just might come to him, repent, and call upon him as Lord and Savior, that there would be this revival among the Jewish people, that they would return to Jesus and submit to him as their Lord and King, and that one day all of God's people, Jew and Gentile, like brothers and sisters in the Lord, might gather before Jesus and worship him together through all eternity. Well, we'll end on that note. Thanks for listening. Have a great rest of your day.